The Zephyr Combat Academy floated in the void between three star systems, a monument to interspecies cooperation that somehow managed to look both magnificent and slightly ridiculous. Picture, if you will, a structure designed by committee, where every member insisted their species' architectural preferences be represented. The result was a crystalline spire jutting from a metallic sphere, wrapped in organic curves, and topped with what could generously be called artistic flourishes, but looked suspiciously like the galaxy's most expensive doorstop. Within this testament to diplomatic compromise, the finest warriors from 47 different species gathered to learn the ancient art of beating each other senseless in the name of mutual understanding. The Academy's founders, in their infinite wisdom, had determined that nothing fostered interspecies harmony quite like ritualized violence under academic supervision. The irony was apparently lost on beings who could calculate hyperspace trajectories but couldn't recognize their own contradictions. The training halls buzzed with the controlled chaos of organized mayhem. In one corner, a group of hegemony shock troopers practiced their signature move of turning opponents into abstract art through sheer kinetic force. Nearby, the spider-like arachnans demonstrated why having 8 limbs was considered unsporting in most civilized combat sports. The crystalline collective's representatives stood motionless, communicating through harmonic frequencies that sounded like wind chimes having an argument, while occasionally shattering practice dummies with sonic bursts that made onlookers' teeth ache. Each species brought their own particular brand of martial artistry to the Academy. The Vorthak employed their natural camouflage to practice disappearing mid-combat, which led to an unfortunate number of accidents when instructors walked into invisible students. The aquatic tidal lords had insisted on water-filled training chambers, creating a logistics nightmare that the Academy's administrators were still calculating 17 standard years later. And then there were the energy beings from the Nebula Consortium, who treated physical combat with the same bewildered fascination that most species reserved for ancient art forms or particularly complex tax codes. But perhaps no species approached combat training with quite the same theatrical flair as the Altarians. These 4-armed warrior poets had elevated fighting to a performing art, complete with dramatic poses, flowery pre-battle speeches, and an unfortunate tendency to critique their opponent's technique while simultaneously attempting to pummel them into submission. They viewed each sparring match as an opportunity to demonstrate not just physical prowess but artistic expression, moral superiority, and what they called combat aesthetics. The Academy's friendly sparring program had been designed by beings who clearly had never met an actual warrior. The concept was simple enough. Pair students from different species for controlled combat exercises that would build mutual respect and understanding. The reality involved a complex series of medical waivers, species-specific safety protocols, and an insurance premium that made small governments weep. The instructors maintained that these exercises promoted cultural exchange, though the primary thing being exchanged seemed to be bruises and the occasional broken appendage. Recent additions to the Academy's roster included several species that the galactic community regarded with varying degrees of curiosity and condescension. The humans fell firmly into the latter category. These bipedal mammals had stumbled onto the galactic stage with all the grace of a drunk hegemony trooper at a diplomatic reception. Their technology was primitive, their understanding of galactic politics was adorably naive, and their physical capabilities were, by all scientific measurements, thoroughly unimpressive, which made their acceptance into the Zephyr Combat Academy something of a galactic joke. Vex Karath had heard this joke approximately 437 times since the humans arrived, and he still found it amusing. The heir to the Altarian throne stood nearly 8 feet tall when he bothered to straighten his shoulders, which he rarely did because proper Altarian posture required a slight forward lean that suggested readiness for combat while maintaining artistic dignity. His forearms moved with practiced precision, each one capable of independent action that had earned him victory in 47 consecutive sparring matches. Not that anyone was counting. Except for Vex, who definitely was. His combat record was the stuff of Academy legend, though he preferred to think of it as the natural result of superior breeding, extensive training, and what he modestly called inherent artistic combat sensibility. The Altarian approach to warfare emphasized flowing movements, strategic positioning, and the importance of looking magnificent while defeating one's opponents. Vex had mastered all 3 principles, plus the equally important fourth principle of discussing one's victories with appropriate humility and frequent references to the philosophical implications of combat. The morning training session found Vex observing the human contingent with the sort of bemused tolerance usually reserved for small children attempting complex mathematics. There were 12 of them scattered throughout the academy, each one more laughably fragile than the last. They moved with a peculiar efficiency that lacked the dramatic flair of proper combat training, spoke in quiet voices that suggested either wisdom or the inability to project properly, and seemed entirely too calm for beings whose home planet reportedly featured the sort of environmental hazards that would give most species nightmares. The instructors had initially approached human physiology with scientific fascination. Dr. Zalith, a renowned xenobiologist from the Crystalline Collective, had spent weeks studying human anatomical charts with the sort of intense focus usually reserved for particularly challenging puzzles. Her conclusion, delivered in harmonics that translated roughly to academic dismissal, was that humans represented an evolutionary curiosity rather than a legitimate warrior species. Observe the musculature distribution, she had explained to her colleagues, her crystalline form chiming softly as she gestured toward holographic displays. Inefficient leverage ratios, limited flexibility parameters, and a skeletal structure that appears designed by committee. Their cardiovascular system shows promise, but the overall package suggests adaptation for persistence rather than combat excellence. The other instructors had nodded sagely, filing this information away under interesting but ultimately irrelevant. The humans were here as part of some diplomatic initiative that none of them fully understood, and their role was to provide education regardless of the species' apparent limitations. If the humans wished to embarrass themselves in friendly sparring matches, well, that was a learning experience too. Vex found himself paired with various opponents throughout his academy tenure, each match adding another victory to his increasingly impressive record. He had defeated hegemony shock troopers through superior technique, outmaneuvered Arachnan despite their numerical limb advantage, and even managed to score points against energy beings by predicting their manifestation patterns. His victories were always accompanied by gracious speeches about the honor of facing such worthy opponents, delivered while his defeated adversaries were still recovering from whatever artistic combat technique he had employed. The betting pools that inevitably formed around academy sparring matches reflected the general consensus about human capabilities. Odds on any human victory started at approximately 1,000 to 1 and got worse from there. The bookmakers, primarily operated by enterprising students from species with natural mathematical inclinations, had initially refused to accept bets on human matches at all, citing concerns about taking money under false pretenses, which made it all the more surprising when Riley Chen stepped forward during routine pairing announcements and calmly accepted Vex's challenge. The human female stood roughly 6 feet tall, possessed the standard 2 arms that her species was apparently satisfied with, and moved with an economy of motion that suggested either supreme confidence or complete ignorance of what she was getting into. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical style that emphasized function over form, and her expression maintained the sort of neutral calm that could indicate either Zen-like serenity or the complete absence of functional survival instincts. Vex regarded her with the sort of polite interest he might show to an unusual museum exhibit. She was, he had to admit, a reasonably attractive example of her species, though that was rather like admiring the craftsmanship of a wooden sword while standing next to a plasma cannon. The fact that she had volunteered for a sparring match against him suggested either admirable courage or a fundamental misunderstanding of basic physics. "I appreciate your enthusiasm," Vex said, his voice carrying the sort of patronizing kindness that made several nearby students wince. "Perhaps we might begin with some basic technique demonstrations? I would hate for you to be injured during what should be an educational experience." Riley's response was a slight nod that could have meant anything from agreement to acknowledgement to the human equivalent of a warrior's salute. Her silence was either mysterious or indicated that her species had not yet developed sophisticated verbal communication strategies. The betting odds immediately shifted to 1,500 to 1, with several students placing what they considered charitable wagers on the human lasting more than 30 seconds. The Academy's main sparring arena could accommodate approximately 300 spectators, though it rarely reached capacity except during exhibition matches, or when someone was expected to do something particularly spectacular or embarrassing. News of the Karath-human pairing had spread through Academy gossip networks with the speed that only truly entertaining disasters could achieve. Students arrived in groups, settling into viewing positions with the sort of anticipatory glee usually associated with natural phenomena or particularly elaborate practical jokes. The instructors assembled with their usual academic detachment, data tablets ready to record observations for later analysis. Dr. Zelith's crystalline form resonated with harmonics that suggested scientific curiosity mixed with concern for student safety. Instructor Vorth, a massive hegemony veteran whose scarred hide told stories of 100 real battles, maintained his usual expression of stoic professionalism while privately wondering if the Academy's insurance covered spectacularly one-sided matches. Combat philosopher Threnx, the Altarian instructor responsible for maintaining his species' artistic combat standards, observed the preparations with particular interest. Vex was his most promising student, a young warrior who combined natural ability with proper philosophical grounding. This match represented an opportunity to demonstrate Altarian combat superiority while providing educational benefits for a less advanced species. The fact that it would likely be over quickly was simply an unfortunate limitation of the human condition. The arena itself featured adaptive surfaces that could adjust to accommodate different species' environmental requirements. For this match, the settings remained at standard galactic atmospheric conditions, which favored neither participant particularly, though it did eliminate any home field advantages. Safety barriers hummed with energy fields designed to contain any combat effects that might threaten spectators, while medical stations stood ready with species-specific emergency protocols. Vex entered his pre-combat meditation ritual, a flowing series of movements that demonstrated his mastery of the 4 sacred forms while limbering up his multiple appendages. Each gesture held philosophical significance, representing different aspects of Altarian combat philosophy. Flowing water for adaptability, rising wind for speed, steady mountain for defense, and striking lightning for the decisive moment of victory. The performance was both practical warm-up and artistic statement, designed to intimidate opponents while inspiring appropriate appreciation from observers. Riley, meanwhile, performed what could charitably be called stretching exercises. She bent and twisted with methodical efficiency, testing joint flexibility and muscle responsiveness without any apparent regard for aesthetic considerations. Her preparation lacked philosophical depth, artistic merit, or even basic dramatic flair. She might as well have been preparing to lift heavy objects or perform routine maintenance tasks. The contrast was not lost on the assembled spectators, who whispered observations about the difference between true warrior culture and whatever it was that humans did instead. Several academic types furiously scribbled notes about human pre-combat behavior for later anthropological analysis, though their conclusions would likely focus more on the species' apparent lack of proper ritualistic understanding than any actual combat insights. When the match officially began, Vex approached with the confident grace of a master craftsman demonstrating his art to appreciative students. His first movements were deliberately slow and controlled, designed to showcase proper technique, while giving his opponent time to appreciate the fundamental differences in their respective skill levels. He employed the opening flower technique, a classical Altarian form that used all 4 arms in a coordinated pattern intended to overwhelm opponents through sheer technical complexity. Riley responded by backing away and maintaining defensive distance, which was exactly what everyone expected. Her movements were economical rather than elegant, focused on avoiding contact rather than engaging in proper combat exchange. This confirmed the prevailing wisdom about human combat limitations. They were built for running away rather than standing and fighting. The crowd murmured appreciatively as Vex pressed his advantage, gradually forcing the human toward the arena's edge through superior positioning and technique. For the first several minutes, the match proceeded exactly as predicted. Vex demonstrated various classical forms, while Riley avoided, dodged, and generally behaved like someone who understood her fundamental disadvantages. The Altarian warrior occasionally landed light touches that would have been devastating strikes in actual combat, each one accompanied by a brief pause to ensure his opponent was uninjured and capable of continuing the educational exercise. The betting pools began paying out early winners as the match's inevitable conclusion appeared increasingly obvious. Students who had wagered on the human lasting more than 5 minutes were already mentally spending their winnings, while the few optimists who had bet on 10 minutes were beginning to look nervous. The instructors maintained their academic objectivity, while privately confirming their initial assessments about human combat capabilities. Vex found himself genuinely impressed by the humans' defensive instincts, though he recognized them as the products of prey species evolution rather than warrior training. Her ability to avoid his strikes demonstrated admirable reflexes, even if her techniques lacked any semblance of proper form or philosophical grounding. This was exactly the sort of cultural exchange the Academy was designed to foster. Superior species providing educational experiences for their less developed galactic neighbors, which made what happened next all the more shocking. The transformation occurred so quickly that most observers initially missed it entirely. One moment Riley was backpedaling away from Vex's latest demonstration of the cascading river technique, and the next moment she was inside his guard, with one of his arms twisted behind his back, at an angle that Altarian anatomy was definitely not designed to accommodate. The crack was audible throughout the arena. Vex's expression shifted from confident instruction to confused surprise to dawning horror as his nervous system registered that his secondary left arm was now bent in a direction that violated several fundamental principles of skeletal engineering. The pain hit approximately half a second later, followed immediately by the realization that he was now pinned by someone he had been casually toying with for the past 8 minutes. The silence that followed was the sort of profound quiet usually associated with natural disasters or particularly significant religious experiences. 300 spectators simultaneously attempted to process what they had just witnessed, while their brains insisted that such things were not supposed to happen according to any known laws of physics, biology, or common sense. Riley released her hold and stepped back with the same calm efficiency she had displayed throughout the match. Her expression remained neutral, as if snapping the arm of a superior opponent was simply another routine training exercise. She offered Vex a slight nod that might have been acknowledgement of a match well fought, then turned toward the instructors to await whatever formal conclusion was required. Vex, meanwhile, discovered that screaming in 4 different languages simultaneously was both physically possible and emotionally satisfying, though it did nothing to address his immediate medical situation. His philosophical training had prepared him for the possibility of defeat, but somehow the curriculum had skipped over the specific protocols for having one's appendages rearranged by supposedly inferior life forms. The medical team descended with the sort of practiced efficiency that suggested this was not their first encounter with Academy training injuries, though the species reversal aspect was certainly novel. Dr. Zelith's harmonic frequencies shifted to what could only be described as academic fascination, mixed with the crystalline equivalent of bewilderment. Her initial assessment of human combat capabilities was clearly going to require significant revision. Instructor Vorth approached Riley with the sort of careful respect usually reserved for unexploded ordnance or students who had just demonstrated capabilities that their files had failed to mention. His scarred hide had taught him to recognize genuine warriors regardless of their species' general reputation, and what he had just witnessed suggested that human military potential might have been somewhat underestimated by galactic intelligence services. Combat philosopher Threnx found himself contemplating philosophical implications that were not covered in traditional Altarian warrior texts. The concept of a supposedly inferior species defeating a superior one through superior technique challenged several fundamental assumptions about combat excellence and species hierarchy. This was going to require extensive meditation and possibly some uncomfortable revisions to established doctrine. The betting pools, meanwhile, faced the sort of mathematical crisis that occurred approximately once per galactic rotation, when all established odds proved to be catastrophically wrong. Several bookmakers immediately declared bankruptcy, while others hastily revised their algorithms to account for variables they had not previously considered relevant to combat prediction. Riley answered the instructor's questions with the same matter-of-fact calm she had displayed throughout the entire incident. Yes, she was uninjured. No, she had not intended to cause permanent damage. The technique she had employed was standard defensive training from her home planet, nothing particularly exotic or advanced. She seemed genuinely puzzled by the level of surprise her victory had generated, as if the outcome had been obvious to anyone with basic pattern recognition abilities. The Academy's administrative staff spent the next several hours hastily revising their human-specific safety protocols while simultaneously wondering what other basic defensive training techniques their newest students might casually possess. The insurance claims were going to be interesting to explain, particularly the section that dealt with species capability assessments, and their relationship to premium calculations. Other human students found themselves suddenly popular for sparring partnerships, though these invitations carried a noticeably different tone than previous requests. The casual dismissal that had characterized most interspecies interactions was replaced by a wary respect that suggested significant recalculation of assumptions about human limitations. Vex spent the following weeks in the medical wing, his arm healing under the care of specialists who had extensive experience with combat injuries, but relatively little experience with humans as anything other than academic curiosities. His recovery was complicated by the need to process not just physical trauma, but the philosophical implications of defeat by someone he had fundamentally underestimated. The Academy's official incident report classified the match as a successful interspecies training exercise with unexpected educational outcomes. The unofficial version, which circulated through gossip networks and betting pools, included considerably more colorful language and several theories about human evolution that would have horrified xenobiologists throughout the galaxy. Dr. Zelith's revised assessment of human combat capabilities included extensive footnotes, multiple disclaimers, and a recommendation that future studies employ significantly larger sample sizes before drawing conclusions about any species' military potential. Her crystalline form had developed what other faculty members swore was the harmonic equivalent of nervous laughter whenever the subject of human physiology arose in academic discussions. The galaxy's perception of humanity underwent what diplomatic historians would later classify as a minor but significant adjustment in threat assessment parameters. Several species that had previously viewed humans as convenient sources of amusing anecdotes began requesting more detailed information about Earth's military capabilities and training methodologies. Trade negotiations that had stalled due to human primitive status were suddenly revisited, with considerably more respectful language and improved terms. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in the Academy's sparring program itself. The friendly matches that had once been characterized by casual superiority and educational condescension were now approached with what instructors carefully termed appropriate caution and mutual respect. The betting odds became significantly more conservative, and several species developed sudden interests in defensive techniques that their warrior cultures had previously dismissed as beneath consideration. The irony, of course, was that Riley's victory had been achieved through exactly the sort of practical, unglamorous training that the Academy's more theatrical approaches had overlooked. While other species developed elaborate philosophical frameworks for combat excellence, humans had apparently focused on the simple principle of making their opponents stop functioning effectively. It was brutally efficient, entirely lacking in artistic merit, and absolutely devastating in its practical application. The galaxy had spent centuries developing sophisticated theories about combat superiority, species hierarchy, and the relationship between physical capabilities and warrior potential. A single human female had just demonstrated that sometimes the most important factor in any fight was not philosophical preparation or technical complexity, but simply the willingness to break someone's arm when the situation required it. Word of the incident spread through galactic communication networks with the sort of velocity usually reserved for celebrity scandals or economic disasters. Within 3 standard days, the match had been analyzed by military strategists on 47 different worlds, each reaching conclusions that ranged from mild concern to outright panic about human combat capabilities. The footage, captured by Academy recording systems for educational purposes, became the most watched training video in galactic military history, surpassing even the legendary hegemony shock trooper Thermos plasma tornado disaster from 2 centuries prior. Military academies throughout known space began hastily revising their threat assessment protocols. The Altarian High Command, in particular, found themselves fielding uncomfortable questions about how their supposedly superior warrior culture had produced a student who could be defeated by what their own intelligence reports had classified as a primitive bipedal species with limited combat potential. The political implications were staggering, especially considering that Vex was not just any student but heir to the Altarian throne. The Crystalline Collective's scientific community went into what could only be described as academic overdrive, demanding extensive research into human physiology, training methods, and evolutionary background. Dr. Zelith found herself appointed to head an emergency xenobiology committee, tasked with determining whether humans represented a previously unrecognized threat to galactic stability. Her initial reports, which included phrases like systematic underestimation of species capabilities and fundamental flaws in current threat assessment methodologies, caused several governments to quietly review their diplomatic positions regarding Earth. The economic ramifications proved equally significant. Interstellar betting syndicates, having lost massive amounts of currency on what they had considered the safest wager in the galaxy, began investigating whether the match had been fixed. When their analysis confirmed that Riley had simply been better at combat than anyone had anticipated, several major gambling operations declared bankruptcy, while others hastily revised their species-specific odds algorithms. The phrase human factor entered galactic finance terminology as a warning about the dangers of assuming predictable outcomes based on incomplete data. Earth's diplomatic mission, which had been operating from a position of supplicant weakness since humanity's introduction to galactic society, suddenly found themselves fielding requests for military cooperation agreements and technological exchange programs. Ambassador Patricia Hendricks, who had spent months being politely dismissed by alien bureaucrats, discovered that her appointment requests were now being accepted with remarkable efficiency. The galaxy's perception of humanity had shifted from harmless primitives seeking guidance to potentially dangerous unknowns requiring careful management. Riley herself remained largely oblivious to the broader implications of her victory, focusing instead on her continued training at the Academy. She expressed mild surprise when informed that her sparring match had become a subject of interstellar political discussion, commenting that she had simply employed standard defensive techniques taught at basic military training facilities throughout human space. This casual revelation prompted frantic inquiries about Earth's military education system and whether all humans possessed similar capabilities. The Academy's curriculum underwent significant modifications in response to what administrators carefully termed recent pedagogical insights. New courses were added covering assumption-based threat assessment failures, while existing programs expanded to include modules on species capability variance and the importance of comprehensive intelligence gathering. The friendly sparring program was temporarily suspended pending development of improved safety protocols and more accurate participant evaluation procedures. Other human students at the Academy found their social dynamics dramatically altered. Where they had previously been treated with condescending benevolence, they now encountered respectful caution tinged with genuine curiosity about their training backgrounds. Study groups that had politely excluded humans began extending invitations, while combat instructors requested demonstrations of typical human defensive techniques for educational purposes. The psychological impact on non-human students proved particularly profound. Generations of species superiority assumptions had been challenged by a single demonstration of practical effectiveness over theoretical sophistication. Several students from warrior cultures requested transfers to different programs, claiming they needed time to reassess their philosophical approaches to combat excellence. The Academy's counseling services reported a significant increase in appointments related to what psychologists termed species confidence adjustment issues. Vex's recovery became a matter of diplomatic concern as well as medical necessity. His father, the Altarian War King, had initially planned to demand satisfaction for his son's injury, until informed that the match had been conducted according to established Academy protocols and that Vex had volunteered for the encounter. The political implications of a royal heir being defeated by a human female required delicate handling to avoid broader diplomatic incidents between the Altarian Empire and Earth's emerging interstellar presence. The Zephyrin Combat Academy continued its mission of fostering interspecies understanding through ritualized violence, though the understanding being fostered was somewhat different than originally intended. Students learned valuable lessons about assumptions, respect, and the importance of proper threat assessment. The friendly sparring matches remained friendly, but with the sort of friendship that comes from genuine mutual wariness rather than comfortable superiority. The galaxy's military establishments began conducting comprehensive reviews of their intelligence gathering methods, particularly regarding species that had been casually dismissed as non-threatening. Several conflicts that had been considered inevitable were quietly postponed, pending better understanding of all participants' actual capabilities. The phrase Riley-Chen protocols entered military terminology as shorthand for the importance of accurate threat assessment regardless of target species' apparent limitations. The most immediate practical change occurred in combat sports throughout civilized space. Professional fighting leagues, which had operated under species-segregated divisions for millennia, found themselves facing unprecedented demand for interspecies exhibition matches. Promoters who had built careers on predictable outcomes suddenly discovered that unpredictability was far more profitable than certainty. The Galactic Combat Federation hastily established new weight and capability classes, while struggling to develop fair competition standards for beings whose physiological advantages varied in ways their rulebooks had never contemplated. Riley's training regimen became a matter of intense scholarly interest. Academy researchers documented her daily routine with the sort of meticulous attention usually reserved for archaeological discoveries or particularly rare quantum phenomena. They discovered that human military training emphasized practical application over theoretical knowledge, focusing on techniques that worked efficiently rather than those that looked impressive or carried philosophical significance. This approach baffled instructors from species whose combat traditions valued artistic expression and moral instruction as highly as tactical effectiveness. The human approach to warfare, as revealed through Riley's casual competence, suggested a species that had evolved under conditions requiring constant practical problem-solving rather than ritualized conflict resolution. Where other species had developed elaborate codes of combat honor, humans had apparently developed an unsettling willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve victory. This pragmatic ruthlessness, disguised beneath diplomatic politeness and apparent physical limitations, represented a paradigm shift in how galactic military planners approach strategic thinking about potential human involvement in future conflict. And somewhere in the medical wing, Vex Koreth contemplated the philosophical implications of his defeat while his arm healed, and his ego underwent what his instructors diplomatically called educational reconstruction. He had learned valuable lessons about combat, respect, and the dangers of underestimating opponents based on incomplete information. It had been, by all academic measures, a highly successful educational experience, though he probably would have preferred a less painful curriculum, and certainly one with fewer interstellar political ramifications.